The hollow of whispering pines. 5 friends, Sarah, Mark, Lisa, James, and Emily, had always been drawn to the strange and eerie, often seeking out abandoned places and haunted locales. But when Mark stumbled across an old, tattered journal in an antique shop, he found something different. The journal told of Whispering Pines, a secluded forest deep in the mountains, infamous for being the site of multiple disappearances over the decades. Legend said that those who entered were never seen again, their voices lingering in the trees as if trying to warn others. The journal spoke of an ancient force living in the forest, something old, something hungry. Intrigued by the stories, they decided to make a weekend trip to explore the forest. It was a cold, overcast Friday morning when they set out, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the promise of adventure. They were excited. This was the kind of thrill they lived for. They made their way through the woods, their boots crunching against the dry leaves, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. At first, it was just a normal hike. The forest felt eerie, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The group laughed and joked, their voices cutting through the thick silence around them. But as the hours wore on, something began to feel off. The trees, which had once felt like an ordinary forest, now seemed to grow closer together, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew colder, and an unsettling stillness settled in. By evening, they had lost track of time. They hadn't seen any signs of other people or wildlife, just the constant whisper of wind through the trees. Emily, the most superstitious of the group, began to feel uneasy, convinced that something was following them. She suggested they head back, but Mark insisted they continue. After all, they hadn't yet found the heart of the forest, where the journal claimed the most chilling phenomena occurred. As they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew thicker, as if the trees themselves were watching. The whispers began, soft, almost imperceptible at first. It sounded like the wind, but it didn't follow the usual patterns of nature. There was something deliberate about it. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" Mark replied, his voice strained, now beginning to sense the strange energy around them. "It's like whispering, almost like voices." The others paused. They were all aware of the strange noise now. Low, distant murmurs like hushed voices calling their names. James laughed nervously, shaking it off as wind. But Emily, her face pale, could barely stand still. "I don't like this," she whispered. "We need to leave." But before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled, just for a moment, and then the forest went dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then, a figure appeared ahead of them, standing motionless between the trees. It was a woman dressed in tattered white, her hair long and wild. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Is that a person?" Mark asked, his voice tight with tension. They approached cautiously, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, swaying slightly as if caught in the breeze. But the breeze was gone. "Hello?" Lisa called out, her voice breaking the silence. The woman's head snapped towards them with unnatural speed. Her eyes, now fully glowing, were empty. No pupils, just black voids. She opened her mouth, and instead of a scream or a word, a high-pitched wail erupted from her, the sound piercing the stillness. The forest seemed to come alive then. The trees groaned, their branches shifting unnaturally, and from the shadows more figures emerged, shrouded in white, their faces hidden. They moved slowly, almost floating, their whispers rising in volume, a cacophony of voices. "Run!" Sarah screamed, pulling the others into motion. But the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the path they had followed now disappearing into thick fog. They ran, but the whispers grew louder, clearer and more frantic. They could hear their own names being called, their voices interspersed with others. Strange, unknown voices, all begging them to stop, to listen, to turn around. Emily was the first to fall behind, her breath ragged, her legs giving way. When they turned to help her, the woman in white was standing behind her, her mouth agape, as if ready to swallow her whole. "No!" James shouted, but before anyone could react, Emily was gone, swallowed by the mist. There was nothing left but the sound of her desperate screams fading into the distance. The remaining 4 friends pushed on, but the forest seemed to close in around them. Each step they took, the trees shifted, guiding them deeper. The whispers became maddening, voices repeating their worst fears, their deepest regrets, until they could barely hear their own thoughts. By dawn, they were lost. The forest had changed. The path was gone, the landscape unfamiliar. And then, the ground beneath them trembled again, and from the mist, they saw the woman once more. Only this time, she wasn't alone. The figures, those pale, faceless forms, were surrounding them, silent, watching. They screamed for help, but the forest swallowed their voices. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and then everything went silent. The next day, a search party found the group's abandoned campsite, empty, save for a few scattered belongings and a trail of footprints leading into the forest. But no one ever found the missing friends. Some say they still hear their voices on the wind, calling out from the hollow of whispering pines. But if you listen too closely, you might hear your own name among them, just before the mist swallows you whole.